Hi everyone, and welcome to this session at EGX Digital 2020. My name's Becky Hewitt and I'm a part-time game designer at Flix Interactive. I'd like to talk to you today about working part-time in the games industry and explore why there aren't more opportunities available. So let's get started. First, a little bit about me. So I've worked in the games industry since 2006. I started off as a tester and then worked my way into design. And during that time I worked on quite a few different platforms and many different game genres, from racing games to online shooters and everything in between. And after 10 years of being in the industry, my partner and I decided to start a family. However, I wanted to retain everything I'd built up in my career because I'd worked so hard. I asked my employer at the time if I could go part-time, and astonishingly they said yes. They were extremely supportive and, I still believe, quite pioneering in their attitudes. Equally, when I moved on to Flix, they were incredibly supportive of having me part-time. So, I'd like to ask the question, why aren't more games companies like this? The current situation as it stands is that I couldn't find any part-time positions on games industry websites advertising jobs. And in over 14 years in the games industry, I haven't come across a single one. Many other industries offer part-time positions. So it's interesting to ask the question, why our industry doesn't? Some people I've spoken to are afraid even to ask for part-time positions. And this is a really dangerous situation to be in if people can't ask for what they want. So you may ask, why on earth does this matter to me? Well, we've had many conversations recently about diversity in the games industry and how we can improve it. And I do believe that offering part-time positions can help to improve the diversity in our industry. Also, if you think about it, if employees choose to go on and have children, there is a loss of experienced and talented people that have to move on elsewhere when they get to that stage in their life. But also, it can cover people who maybe have to care for elderly relatives or others. So I'd like to explore why I think part-time roles are rare, and you probably have your own opinions on it. So I think that there is a preconception that part-time employees might not be very committed or very productive because they're not there as much as full-time employees. But in my experience, I've been told that my productivity is definitely on par with other full-time employees, because when I am in work, I'm very focused and I want to make the most of the days I have. I thoroughly enjoy being at work and I want to spend my hours being as productive as possible. I think there's also a preconception that part-time employees aren't there when they're needed. Now obviously, both sides here need to be a little bit flexible. So I need to be open to rearranging my childcare if there's fires that need to be put out. And my employer needs to understand that there are times when I may not be able to drop everything. But I think the games industry as a whole definitely has an issue with extra hours becoming the norm. And it's going to depend very much on the company culture as to whether part-time roles will fit in. There's also the idea that some employers have of hiring employees based on the value that they bring, not necessarily just the hours worked. Another preconception about part-time employees is that they're not as experienced or maybe even not as educated as full-time employees. But of course, it could be that the opposite is true. For example, slightly older employees who want to start a family. The other point to raise is that generally it's thought that it costs more to onboard part-time employees and to keep them up to date on a day-to-day basis. And I have a few tips and tricks that might be able to mitigate this sort of thing. So can part-time roles work? Well, of course, yes. I'm a part-time employee and I feel I'm working quite effectively. I think some of the key elements for success for the employer would be giving the part-time employee self-contained work, so there's less need for catching up with other team members and they can have more ownership on the feature that they're working on without having to rely on going backwards and forwards to other people. Another thing that I certainly use is chats through Teams and Skype that can be read any time of day. I can catch up on those outside of hours and understand what's been happening while I've been away. I also use online documents, obviously, so that I can read and catch up on what's been happening with design work. But also, employees need to give tasks that are appropriate to the time frame, and that goes without saying. So some of the key elements for working successfully part-time for employees, I think, would be being prepared for a steep learning curve every time you return to work. Things move on quickly in the games industry, so every time you come back after a short break, there is a certain amount of getting your head back in the game and catching up. You just have to be prepared that that's what you're going to have to do. Obviously, offering overtime and flexibility where you can goes a long way, but be prepared that promotions might have to wait. Obviously, it may seem unfair for an employer to promote you when you're not doing as many hours as other employees are, and that would be up to you to negotiate with your employer. One of the things I've experienced myself is feeling left out socially because you're not there all the time, which can be an important part of work to a lot of people, and also feeling one step behind. But that is an issue for communication. You also have to be prepared that some people may have to complete your work at some point in time, and that feels pretty rubbish. But sometimes it's a reality of game development. You also might have to do some less fun tasks than you would have before, because they might be more self-contained or require less guidance from others, and that's okay. I think accepting that it can be frustrating sometimes goes a long way. Personally, I get very frustrated at not being able to be at work as much as I'd like to be, but I would rather have that than not have a job at all. So I'd like to give a working example of how part-time working can actually produce successful results. This was a feature that I worked on from Sea of Thieves. It was a new weapon called the Blunderbomb, a throwable weapon with explosion and knockback. And I was trusted with having ownership of the feature, obviously with support from both the Rare and Flix team, who did an awesome job of supporting me, by the way. So there were some key areas that really helped me in working part-time to get this feature to retail. When we scheduled the feature, we looked at a fairly long time frame for completion and also had weekly reviews of it so that any problems or missing parts could be quickly dealt with. From an engineering standpoint, it was a straightforward implementation because similar mechanics already existed, so it didn't require a lot of back and forth with code. I also made sure I had regular check-ins with the programmers, even when I wasn't in work, to make sure things were going to plan. From the design side, there were discussions in chat on Teams and in person to shape the feature, and we were able to get those done in the hours I was in work. I also provided a concise written design so that work could be continued when I wasn't there. From a testing standpoint, we provided a clear outline of the feature for testing, so testing could carry on even if I wasn't present. So what do you think? Is it time for a change? It would be nice to get to the point where employees have found they have the ability to discuss options like this with their employers. Let's have some open conversations about whether part-time work could work for your company. And think about it. Would you rather lose experienced employees or offer them a part-time position? I genuinely believe this is a good route to diversity in the workforce, as it will broaden the scope of people who can apply for jobs. Coronavirus has taught us many things, but one of them is that we can think more creatively about the way we work. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the EGX Digital 2020 show.